Yeah. All right. Well, we're holding steady right here about at 67. So I'll go ahead and get started. So I want to welcome everybody. My name is Landon Brooks. I work for HeartLands Conservancy. I'm the Communications and Engagement Manager for the organization. And one of the projects that I work on is our native plant sale. So we have somebody. Faith Clark says hello to everybody. But anyway, so we just started doing our plant sale in the fall. We had a fall plant sale, and now we have the spring one. We're also offering, in addition to all native plants, we're offering rain barrels and composters, and actually tumbling composters this time as well. So if anybody's unaware of that, I'll put the link in the chat here in a minute. But yeah, so gardening with natives. So why do we garden with natives, and what are natives, I guess, is important. And you know, there's a long list of things we could talk about gardening with natives, but ultimately it is native plants belong here. They do well in our area because they adapted here over time, and they help support the ecosystem. So the birds, the bees, the butterflies, beetles, wasps, all of those things, you know, they help support. And when you garden with natives, you use less water. Once they're established, you really don't have to tend to them that much, with the rare occasion that Elizabeth will kind of mention on some of these that she has to do some editing for. But basically, you plant them and they thrive in our conditions. So as HeartLands Conservancy, as an organization, you know, we do environmental projects. We're all about supporting the environment and making the Southwestern Illinois a better place for not only the people, but the animals and the environment. So that's why we're offering native plants in our plant sale. So with us today, I have two of the people I look up to a lot, and two of the best gardeners I think I've ever seen. Ned Siegel is a Illinois master naturalist, and he's also a Missouri master gardener, or St. Louis master gardener, I apologize. And Elizabeth Wahle does all kinds of stuff for the University of Illinois Extension, and she's basically Mother Earth. So I invited them to speak with us today because they have a lot of experience with the actual plants being offered in our sale, and they have perspectives that I think you'll find very valuable. The goods, the bads, the uglies on some of these, and some of how you can care for these plants. So if you guys want, you can kind of take over from here, and I'll just, we want this to be kind of conversational, kind of laid back. We are plant people, and it's spring, and we've been in isolation for some time. So we have a lot of things to talk about. This webinar will probably take a little bit over an hour, maybe even close to 2 hours. So if you want, go ahead and grab some wine and just kind of hang out with us and talk about plants.
Well, thanks, Landon. You know, Ned and I had a good time doing this because, as you mentioned, we've never met a plant that we didn't like. There's some that, and I'm borrowing Pete Oldhoff's term, we don't weed, we edit out what we don't want. And so I will mention some of those that are a little more aggressive in the garden, but still well worth it. You know, as Ned and I were going through here, we talked about that we want to make sure that we give credit to some really important resources for all gardeners that we use as well. One of them is the Missouri Botanical Gardens Plant Finder. And so throughout this presentation, we're going to use their information provided for height, spread, bloom, time, the sun requirements, and also soil moisture requirements. And so that kind of gives us a baseline of it's not being my garden or Ned's garden. We're just kind of using Missouri Botanical's ranges for that. We also, Ned found a really great site that I hadn't latched onto, and that's the Natural History Museum in London. They have a host database on worldwide listing of plants that are host plants for Lepidopteran. And so that's moths and butterflies. And so we're providing you information on which plants are actually host plants for different types of butterflies and moths and so forth. And we used a lot of reading from the website Illinois Wildflower. If you've used it, it's well worth supporting as well. And he does quite a bit of work, not only on descriptions of plants, but he gives quite a bit of great information on who pollinates these native plants. So if you haven't checked out Illinois Wildflower, very good resources. Now the pictures throughout came from Ned and I. I think most of them are from our gardens or on projects that we've worked on. And Ned, have you got anything else to, why don't we just go ahead and go to the first slide and you can kind of detail how we've got them laid out. So you're up first.
Thank you.
Oh yeah. Oh, before we get started, just to let people know, this we are gonna record it starting now. And I'm gonna send out a link to everybody tomorrow. So if we do run over the time that you have, you'll get an email tomorrow. You can watch the rest of it then.
So great. Thank you, Landon. Thank you, Elizabeth, and welcome everyone. It's really exciting to know that we've got 76 participants. So a lot of interest out there in gardening with natives, which again, we feel is very important as it has to do with restoring the ecosystem. You've heard about the insect apocalypse and the bird apocalypse. And so the relationships between our plants and the insects that feed or visit them to help pollinate or use them as host plants all feed on up the ecosystem to support our bird populations, etc. So a lot of this really, Doug Tallamy, who many of you have heard from and noted, ecologist from out on the East Coast, has really kind of set this in motion with a couple of big books that are kind of become the Bibles of ecology now. And so I think a lot of us as gardeners are looking to how we can facilitate ecosystem recovery, etc. So kudos to Landon and the good folks at HeartLands for putting the sale together. But moreover, I think Landon mentioned a couple of things that went into the thoughts behind the sale, but he didn't mention that he's included a lot of unique plants that you may not find at your local box stores and so, or even at local garden centers. And so that's really exciting too, as people build diversity into their garden. And so, and in addition to that, I think both Elizabeth and I are focusing on, as Elizabeth mentioned, plants that we have familiarity with, but then we're also going to try to bring in birds or bees or insects or butterflies, whatever, in some of the pictures that we've taken. So in addition, it's a wide range of both perennial plants, water plants, trees, shrubs, so a number of different, like I mentioned, an array of plants. And starting off now with a tree. So this is Ohio buckeye. And so this is one of the trees that I was happy to see this included in the sale, because it's not something, again, that is typically a landscape tree that you might select. It is obviously an Illinois native. In the wild, it's found mostly in moist soils, and it's considered to be slow growing. A couple things that I really like about it. So the picture on the left lower is a picture from Elizabeth, and you can see the flowers covering the tree. The flowers emerge after the leaves, and the beautiful panicle in the center is actually in my yard on about a 10-foot tall tree. So these don't have to be huge trees to begin flowering. The flowers are actually pretty spectacular. They're interesting too. They have the male staminate flowers towards the top and down, and there are usually only a few perfect flowers, which mean flowers that have both the male and the female parts, and therefore can be fertilized and turns into nuts. So the nuts themselves are the buckeye, the polished buckeye that many of you might have carried in your pocket as school children. And so, but they're actually toxic to most mammals. They do eat, I think Elizabeth finds that the squirrels do eat hers and spread the seeds around as well. They aren't a heavy fruiter, so you don't have a rainfall of nuts coming down on your roof, but They're a nice tree. It's a flowering tree, and it certainly is a good option to the Bradford pear, for instance. They're visited when the flowers come out. It's usually in April into May, and that's right when the ruby-throated hummingbirds are returning. So this is a flower that they find attractive and they like to feed on as they come into town. So several moss species use it as a host plant, and native bees are associated with pollinating the flowers. On the right, from a winter interest perspective, the buckeye on the lower right is one of the trees that's oppositely arranged. So you can see the branches down there come off of the trunk, the stem, in an opposite fashion. So those are the maples, the ashes, the dogwoods, and the buckeyes, or Mad Buck as the acronym goes. So it's kind of a nice way to remember it. Their trunk is also a grayish color, kind of a warty, rough texture to it. But this is a tree that you can actually pick out in the middle of winter based upon its opposite branching and the color of its bark. So,
And the flowers look like orchids.
yeah, they're really pretty.
They're really pretty. Oh, also, if anybody has any questions or comments or wants to share, resources, go ahead and put those in the chat too. I want to let everybody know. And then I'll be answering questions as we go too.
Well, Ned was talking about the buckeye, and one of its other characteristics is it blooms after the leaves are on the tree. And the one I'm talking about here, serviceberry, it actually blooms before the leaves are on the tree. And so this is a really early flowering shrub. This is one that's in my yard, and I have pictures around April 24th is when it's traditionally in bloom. This is what I would call a large shrub, very smooth bark. It has interesting winter interest because of its grayish, smooth, almost like beech bark on it. And it will get up to a height of, 30 feet in many, many years. And so it doesn't get there right away. But what is very showy about it is the bloom on it. So very early bloom with white. There are a number of native vars, but this is the straight species here. But one of its other seasonal interest is it produces berries. And I have berries here, what they look like on June 9th. And this is where they're just kind of starting out pink and working their way towards that really dark blue color. And so if you're looking for plants for wildlife food, this one also produces berries. They are also edible. This is in the rose family. So the berries themselves are edibles by humans for jams and juices and so forth. When we look at it as a host plant, so a tiger swallowtail caterpillar actually utilizes the foliage for food through its development stage. And also it's pollinated early on. So this is a really nice earlier food source for a number of bees and butterflies. So for both pollen and for nectar. And so two major seasons of interest. If you were citing this one, this will take some part shade. It's naturally usually found along streams or wet areas, but it will actually take some average soil as well. So I would say anywhere from average to probably more towards moist rather than dry. And as we move through, I have the next one too. So this is another rose family member in the shrub category, and this is a black chokeberry. And you can guess by the name that the berries are rather astringent to our taste buds, but they are edible. And if you add enough sugar to anything, you can utilize. So they have been utilized in jams and jellies as well. And so this is another multi-stem shrub that spreads by suckering. You can easily control its size and spread though by judicious pruners or lopping of it to maintain its size. But if you have an area that you can allow it to really take over, it makes a nice type of hedging type of shrub. And so it has the standard beautiful rose flowers that come on after the leaves. On this particular ones, they're white. The transition to berries that eventually turn to a black color later in the season. So you see that this one's a little bit later blooming than our previous serviceberry. And we're kind of switching gears to a perennial. And I just absolutely love this one. This just kind of has, there's a couple of plants that we're going to be talking about that just kind of remind me of a sky blue when it's just, you know, thinking about raining. Just has that slightly gray blue flower. So this is Blue Star. The flowers are a whitish blue color. And this particular one is on the tips. And so these are just covered with star type flowers and blooming in my yard. And I'm in the Glen Carbon area. It's usually around, you know, that third week of April. This is a, you know, to me, a nice size perennial. It gets, you know, 2 to 3 feet tall by the same amount of width. It is visited by a number of pollinators. So this is one that if you sat down, you know, with your lawn chair by it and just watch what came and went, you would see hummingbirds, a lot of long-tongued bees. And my favorite one, and I think I have a picture later, is the snowberry clearwing moth that is also called the hummingbird moth. So it kind of looks like a hummingbird until you realize it has 6 little legs and antenna. So this is a fairly erect clump forming plant. And this is really suitable for the top edge of a rain garden, so average soil. So it doesn't want to be down in the bottom of the rain garden, but at the top edge. The flowers are very good as cut flowers as well. And one of the added features is in the fall, the foliage turns somewhat of a yellowish color. And so I think that this is definitely one that we don't see very often in the nursery trade. So take advantage of this one. You know, a nice native ground cover, if you have an area that you need to naturalize or you need to stabilize a slope area that's in a shade area, wild ginger is a really good candidate. And you know, from standing above it and looking down, the main feature is these slightly pubescent or fuzzy green leaves. It will fill an area, I want to say at a moderate rate, not super crazy, but a moderate rate. It is good for around a rain garden because it likes average to wet soil. So you can get it a little bit down the sides of a rain garden, not in the submerged part, but where it's going to stay fairly moist. So again, very good for shady conditions, particularly when you have erosion issues or you have wet soils. Now, I will say that if you get down on your hands and knees, you can't see it from these pictures, but if you get down on your hands and knees, it actually has kind of an attractive flower, but you have to lift up the leaves to see the pretty little white flowers that are underneath.
And this is one, which I'll point out, and actually this is another one. In the plant sale, we are offering plugs, which are a very cost-effective way of, you know, controlling erosion if you're trying to, or different things like that. But the plants that we chose, we did for a particular reason. And one of those reasons is a lot of people were talking to us about, you know, they had a wooded area and they cleared out the bush honeysuckle or whatever their invasive was. And they were having problems with erosion and different things, or they were wanting to naturalize the space in a way that was the least expensive. So we have 10 different plugs available, and most of them are for the shade. And it's for that reason. So
I noticed, Landon, that you were offering some of the trays in half trays or whole trays too. So even if a whole tray was too much for their needs, there's still that option of having a half tray. So when you're doing a big area, definitely a tray option is good. And, you know, that's not offered to us retail a lot of times. So that's nice that you guys are offering that.
yeah, and the trays are, they're the bigger ones. So it's 16 cells for a half or 32 for a full. So they will have some good root structure on them too. So they're not going to be wimpy little plugs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Ned, I'm jealous you have this one. This is one of my favorites.
Mm-hmm.
Take it away.
I want to segue back to the ginger though, before we move forward. One thing is that the wild ginger is not an evergreen ground cover. So those of you that are looking for something evergreen, it's not evergreen. But Elizabeth, there was a question regarding does it hold up to dog traffic? I don't have a dog, so I can't answer that, but I know you do. So is that something that you see is troublesome or not?
You know, I'm gonna wimp out on this. I have a pretty aggressive dog that doesn't care where she runs. I've got a golden retriever, and I haven't really noticed her tearing it up. So she doesn't make a regular trek through it. So that's the best answer that I can say, is that it's not one of those plants that she grabs a hold of and rips out of the ground. Some of these other plants I can say are highly attractive to dogs for some reason, but that one doesn't seem to be one of them for her, at least.
Right, great. So
I wouldn't
moving on,
necessarily.
but go on, Landon.
Somebody asked a question about just regular traffic and not dog traffic. I mean, this isn't a plant that, it's not like a walkway plant necessarily that you
No,
want to step on.
no, definitely not. That's not a walkable.
Mm-mm.
So what we're doing is actually, Elizabeth and I are covering probably about 2/3 of the plants that are in the sale. So I think 46 or 47 altogether, just to let you know. And we're doing it alphabetically. So we'll be moving in and out of woodland or ground cover and then flowering. We thought that was the best way to do it then, rather than by trying to group them by bloom time. But we have largely included bloom period that's in the basic descriptors, and then often whenever we took our picture, we'll include that as well. But this is one of the milkweeds that's being offered, and we hear a lot about milkweeds for the monarchs. And this is swamp milkweed, Asclepias incarnata. And basically it's known for its beautiful pink floral color. And the front top center picture is one that Elizabeth had from her garden. And again, a beautiful color that you don't see in a whole lot of other plants. And then obviously the monarch caterpillar feeding on its foliage. A lot of times, I believe Landon mentioned when we were going over this a week or so ago, that it's not atypical to find your swamp milkweeds completely defoliated when the caterpillars get active on them. So this is one of the plants that you probably want to plant several of. For two different reasons. One is to be able to accommodate the monarch caterpillars when they're feeding on them, but also they're a little persnickety. I don't have 100% survival when I plant a couple of the swamp milkweeds for whatever reason. So again, they look good in a cluster or a mass. The lower left is they tend to be to attract the monarchs. You want them somewhat near the front of your beds is the highest recommendation. And they do attract not only the monarch butterflies that nectar on them and their caterpillars that feed on them, but you can see that there's a bee co-feeding with the monarch on the lower right. Milkweed beetles, milkweed bugs, aphids, bees, wasps, flies, skippers, a lot of insects are attracted to the swamp milkweed, in addition to the monarch and the hummingbird too. So again, a nice plant. It gets fairly tall. So again, it won't fit into everybody's planting bed, but it's a good one if you have the height and you have the place to put it.
You know, Ned, your comment on milkweeds about them being persnickety, I find all of them to be a little bit worthy of buying, 2 or 3. To make sure that you have a take on them.
In my experience with the monarchs, the swamp milkweed, or otherwise you'll find it in stores called rose milkweed a lot of times these days. It tends to be the favorite spot for the caterpillars. I know when we talk about defoliation last year, towards the end of butterfly season, I had just twigs left. I mean, they went to town on it. And then this one, butterfly weed, is another milkweed, which they'll talk about. We're selling them both in trays because you want to plant a lot when you do it, especially if you're going to plant on butterflies, because you'll end up with nothing left sometimes. But I find butterfly weed to be a good food source for the monarch early on. So if you're wanting to catch the monarchs as they're migrating north, mid-May to early June, this is what I have the most luck with. On the way back down, I mostly get them on the swamp milkweed, but I find that they like to eat the flower buds for some reason a lot.
I'm pretty happy if I see them on the plant eating anything.
Yeah.
I get excited when I'm doing it. So as Landon said, this is the next butterfly weed we're going to talk about. And you saw with the previous swamp, the beautiful surreal pink color, and it prefers a wetter site. This is one that prefers a drier site. So average soil to dry for the butterfly weed. And this just has a stop you in your tracks, just beautiful tangerine orange color. And it is another one, as we already mentioned, that is a larval host plant for the monarch butterfly, but it is just alive with insects. And so we're not naming all the insects that are on this plant. This is another one that's always loaded. But as of the pollinators, the same ones, the hummingbird, honeybees, lots of bees, lots of different kinds of bees, lots of different types of butterflies, including the swallowtails in the monarchs. And so this one's a little bit smaller and more filled out type of butterfly weed. And so it's maybe 2.5 feet or so by 1.5 feet across. So it's a smaller plant. You need to bring it closer to the front of the bed so that you can really experience the beauty of this just screaming orange color. Ned, you got the next butterfly weed.
Featuring one more of the milkweeds, and in this case, this is the world milkweed, the Asclepias verticillata, and it's one of the lesser ones. So again, back to Landon wanting to offer some plants that you don't see everywhere. This is one of them. And this tolerates dry soil and also a lot more shade than either the tuberosa or the incarnata. So if you got some sun, part shade situations, this is probably a milkweed that you might want to consider. It's pretty short in stature. It's 1 to 2 feet tall by wide, but it has a really pretty white inflorescence to it. And again, the leaves too, the leaves are whorled and they're finely divided. So very much different from either of the other two milkweeds that are being featured. And again, attracts a wide assortment of insects to nectar on it. And I don't see monarchs too often, but I have a lot of shade, so I don't see a whole lot of monarchs anyway. So I'd be interested to know if people grow this and see it covered with monarchs, but to date I haven't, although it's one of the ones recommended for growing in Illinois as a monarch habitat.
Yeah, I would say for me, the two milkweeds that I get the most action on are the butterfly weed in the spring, and then the swamp milkweed really in the fall. I mean, if you're looking to get in to monarchs, I would start off with those two. I would get a half tray, maybe of each, put one in a wetter spot, one in a drier spot. And I mean, you should get monarchs your first year doing that.
It's pretty exciting when you do get them.
I'll never forget my first monarch.
Yeah. Well, as Ned said, we've covered a lot of different plant types, and we also included some grass. And so this is the first one. This is blue grama grass, and this is part of the Great Plains prairie plants. It's just native throughout this whole entire region. It's one of our smaller statured grasses. So, depending on what your soil conditions are, anywhere from, 9 inches to 2 feet tall, and probably average soil towards dry would be more suitable. It's interesting that this has a common name of mosquito grass, and it's because I guess the namer thought that the seed heads were reminiscent of a mosquito larva. I was always interested in why it was called mosquito grass, and that's the story behind that, whether it's true or not. But we don't usually think about grasses in terms of pollinators and larval plants, but this is actually a host plant for some skippers as well that are native to Illinois that are in this area. So again, we have a tendency to focus on some of the really showy butterflies, the larger ones, but we have a number of smaller butterflies as well that are part of our ecosystem. And as Ned said, you know, their larvae, through numbers also feed quite a large bird population. And so grasses are important host plants, and some of them I'm going to talk about later are also important food sources for a lot of our granivorous birds as well. And so this is one that the seed type is designed to latch on to animals walking by. And so it will pop up and move around in your yard if you do have wildlife moving through. But again, the flowers are nice for, dried for arrangements. And again, good for droughtier, if you have some shallow, rocky type of soil. And this is also good if you have any walnuts or have some problems establishing grasses near walnut. This one's fairly tolerant of it.
Now we're moving to a beautiful shrub. This is beautyberry. So many of you probably have become familiar with that, also known as French mulberry. It's primarily grown for its beautiful fall fruit. It blooms much earlier, from June into July, but the inflorescences are in the axils of the leaves there, but they're relatively insignificant. Illinois Wildflower Insect Feeding Database suggests that there's only one true bug that's known to feed on the foliage, but it is also other sites. The spring azure butterfly apparently uses it as a larval food source. And again, though, however, the showy fall display is really what people are mostly attracted to when planting this in their garden. The rustic sphinx moth, again, is another one. Pollinators, not much is known, again, about any of the floral faunal relationships related in pollination of this. It should be noted this is blooms very late, blooms early again, but then the fruit appears, the photo on the left was October 30th. So really about as the leaves are starting to fall off. So it really pops. It does do better with a little bit of sun rather than full shade. I find that to be really true. And then also it blooms on new wood. So this is a shrub that you can cut back to 6 to 12 inches. I would do it about now, maybe in another few weeks, because that's where you're going to get your colorful fruit attached to it. So I don't think it can, if you don't prune it back, it can become rather ratty or unkempt because it's not a well-structured shrub typically. So again, I would recommend cutting it back. The white one is a variety of it called Lactea, and it's not clear to me the derivation of that. I bought several of the beauty berries and there was a white one in it. So I just kind of lucked out, but they're beautiful. Birds do eat the fruit. Several bird species, the robin, thrasher, a purple finch, and the eastern towhee are apparently use this as one of their fruits in the fall.
And it'll pop around in your yard too.
It will.
Yeah.
You can actually
nice.
grow it from the seeds, so you can collect and plant the seeds as well. So nice shrub.
You know what? Somebody had asked in the questions, which I'm going to put in the rest of the group, but they asked, are there any of these plants deer resistant?
So good question. Yeah, this one does get browsed a little bit by the deer, but not too much. So I have several of these and I have a lot of deer, and they really don't bother it. They'll nibble at it a little bit, but I haven't seen it. As you can see there, it made it through the whole season and fruited well. So they didn't do too much nibbling.
I think I have other things that they much prefer to nibble. So I don't know if it's when they have another choice, because mine's not nibbled either. They definitely nibble other stuff, but that's not one of them.
Well, I just noticed most of the weeds, or not weeds. I'm looking at ironweed on my screen right now. But most of the plants that we're offering in the sale are somewhat deer resistant, as evidenced by the fact that you both have most of these plants. Because you guys both have a lot of deer. So
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting to think about that. I don't know.
Yeah. So I think it's a good point because the literature actually suggests that the Calocarpa does get browsed by deer. So if it's the only plant you have, they might, do that. A lot of times deer are just opportunistic hunters, and they might nibble on it one day, and that's the only time they ever choose to do it. They don't like the taste of it or whatever. But this isn't deer candy, at least in my yard, like some plants are. Hosta, forget about it. Deer candy.
Not native. That's good.
Yeah, not native.
Well, we're moving back to a grass. I absolutely love this. And this one is called the palm sedge. And as you can look at the close-up picture, the leaves are reminiscent of palm. And this is one that would be more suited to an area that is average to wet. And I will say that the drier it is, probably it would appreciate a little bit of afternoon protection from the sun. So if you're wet, it can probably take full sun, but if you start getting a little bit on the dry side, it probably needs some afternoon shade to help it out. So this is, will also get pretty floppy when it's in shade. So it has much better structure when it's in full sun. Patches probably 2 to 3 foot in both directions, width and height. And it will naturalize slowly by rhizome. So if you pop in several plants to fill in, they will eventually grow together. This is one of those plants that I mentioned that is a larval host plant for some skippers and butterfly caterpillars, but it's also a seed source by a lot of birds like ducks and sparrows and towhees and also squirrels and voles. So it offers food for wildlife as well. So if you're looking for grass species, this is probably one of the prettier ones. I really like this one.
So here's a shrub. This is a button bush. This is considered a semi-aquatic plant. It's a good plant if you have moist areas. It's great rain garden plant, for instance. It can tolerate both moist and wet feet, but then can do fairly well in periods that dry out as well. So it blooms in June in these great big beautiful buttons that appear. Those are 1 to 3 of these flower heads appear typically on the terminal end of a branch. Again, they're about 1.5 inches across, and they're comprised of a lot of tiny little flowers. And what you see sticking out of these flowers are the stigmas and the style and the stigma on the end. So they give us this like starship appearance. So it's really a unique flower to have. You can't miss them. And feeding on this one, in this case, is a harvestman. Depends upon where in the country you come from. Some people call it a harvestman, others a daddy long leg spider, although it is not a spider, it is an arachnid, but not a spider. And those little red balls, those are parasitic red mites, which I think Elizabeth informed me what they were. I didn't know what they were on there. And apparently they don't kill the harvestman, but anyway, it just kind of emphasizes that they are attractive to different insects, and hummingbirds are attracted to them as well. So that's pretty much all I wanted to say. The mammalian herbivores, including deer, avoid the foliage as it's poisonous, but birds and migrating waterfowl will eat the seed that appears where the buttons were. So that's a nice plant, again, if you have a wet area.
Yeah. Wet.
Pardon?
Wet.
Wet, yeah.
I've seen them growing kind of even just, submerged in water.
Yeah.
Actually, if you go out to the Arlington wetlands, up by the bank on the right side, as you get off of the bridge, there's one that's growing in water. Yeah. People think it looks like the coronavirus.
It looks like Sputnik to me.
Right.
I'm not thinking about coronavirus. I have to agree, but I'm going to step away from that one.
I know, I can't unsee that.
Yeah, I know.
Been there, done that.
Yeah.
This is rose turtlehead or purple turtlehead. It's a Chelonia obliqua. It's relatively more rare than the white farm. The white one is Chelone glabra. This is a native of Illinois along with the white, however, and it's really another nice plant if you have a fairly wet area. I have a little creeklet that cuts through my yard, and so I have this planted down in that depression, and it really takes off. It's somewhat clonal, so it will spread a little bit, but it's not wildly spreading. It pairs very nicely with the wild impatiens, the little touch-me-nots if you have them, and it's a favorite habitat for hummingbirds, but also the picture I have is a common eastern bumblebee, and it actually pries that flower open, then going with the arrow, it goes all the way down, disappears completely in there, and then reemerges. So I had fun watching the bumblebees just go in and out of the flower, of course, doing what they're doing to gather nectar and pollen, and in the process, pollinating the plant. So it's really a nice plant. I like it a lot. The foliage is relatively bitter. So with respect to the questions about the deer, it's typically avoided by the deer, and yeah, a nice plant for a wetter area.
Oh, we forgot to mention all these pictures that you're seeing are actually Ned and Elizabeth's pictures. So when they know their stuff on these plants because they've interacted with them, you know, in their own yards, or some of them were some places that you visit, but for the most part, yeah.
You know, I've had several friends that this was their favorite flower, and I'm kind of leaning towards this might be my favorite flower, or my favorite native flower, or very high up on my list. This is the pale purple coneflower, and so this is one of the echinacea. This is Plida, and you know, this is one that I have it listed as dry to medium, but I think what's important on this one is that it has sharp drainage, meaning that it doesn't sit in wet soil for any period of time. So even after you have a heavy rainfall like we've had recently, and you walk around and it's all squishy outside, it shouldn't be squishy around this plant. It just really doesn't appreciate any soil that retains water. So well drained is probably how I would describe this one. And it's a little bit different from some of the other echinacea in that it has more of really narrow leaves that are held in a really bunched, you know, low to the ground, and then leafless stems that are, you know, easily 2 foot tall, topped with these beautiful pale purple pink flowers. And so they're like they're floating on these little wires above the tuft of foliage, and so quite beautiful. And this is a host plant for silvery checker spot. And it also is visited by a number of pollinators, lots of bees, butterflies, and skippers. Later in the season, when fall is coming on, you'll start seeing goldfinches sitting on top of these. And it's really kind of neat to see it. You know, when they land on it, it weights down, it kind of bobs around a little bit while they're feeding on the seed of these. And so if you have a site that is very well drained, try the pale purple coneflower. It's just absolutely a stunning plant.
You know, Elizabeth, talking about well drained, and do you think that this one would succeed in a pot situation, like in a perennial planter?
As long as the soil media, again, was well drained. It's not necessarily dry, it's well drained. That is the important component for this particular one. So yeah, if you had a good, you know, I've grown these actually in pots before, and I've grown them in a much lighter soil so that it's not too heavy. So well drained is one of the keys for that particular one. This next plant, Landon, always surprises me because this is actually in the carrot family. And if you look at the stem structure, it does remind me of a carrot, but the flower doesn't at all. It kind of almost goes back to buttonweed, the way, you know, those little round balls. But this is the rattlesnake master. This is another one that does not appreciate sitting in overly moist soil. So again, well-drained soil, that dry to medium. And this is a host plant for a specialist moth. This is a rattlesnake master borer moth. And so this is one that's actually, if you look at the list, that's imperiled in Illinois. And so I actually ordered some more of these from you so that I can plant some more, so that maybe I can help, have some sites for this particular moth to come in. But it's visited by just an absolute host of pollinators, both bees and skippers, moths, lots of plant bugs and beetles. They're just all over this. So almost anything in the carrot family is really attractive to pollinators and other insects. A little bit, excuse me, this is a rather tall plant, 4 to 5 feet tall easily, more narrow and upright. You can see in this picture, the one on the right, it's actually been staked up. So this is one that particularly the first couple of years maybe of establishment, it may need to have some staking before it really gets a good grip on its site. Does beautiful, you can see in this picture, backed with something like Joe Pye weed that's taller than it, good color combo on it. So a very showy, a very, very showy plant, and not real common in the trade. So this is another one to try and grab while you can.
I was surprised the other day when I was poking around in the garden that this was rattlesnake master was one of the first things popping up. So.
And speaking of plants that aren't very often offered in the trade, this is another one. This is Eastern Wahoo. It has a cool name as well, Euonymus atropurpureus. So there are a couple of bad boy euonymus species. There's the winged burning bush and also the winter creeper, which are both euonymuses, which you don't want to be planting. This is a good one, however. This is, again, Eastern Wahoo. It's really a shrubby plant to a small tree, as it can get up to 20 feet tall and 15 to 20 feet wide. It prefers full sun to part shade. I have a dappled shade where this is growing, and it actually flowers early in the spring, very inconspicuous signs of flowers, 7 to 20 little 4-petaled flowers that are kind of the color of the pawpaw flower. If you know, it's like a reddish purple flower that's attractive apparently to flies. One of those flowers, I don't smell a scent to it, but apparently it looks like carrion. So there are flies that are attracted. The white-marked tussock moth apparently feeds on its leaves as well. Now, this is one that I think the deer will be attracted to. There's a strawberry bush is another euonymus species, another native one, which is pretty much deer candy. So I planted this one, kind of try to hide it in a shrub border. So it's behind an oak leaf hydrangea and right in front of a walnut tree. So this one also tolerates being planted by walnuts, which a lot of plants do. The primary focus for this plant, however, are the beautiful berries, and my photographs don't do it justice. These berries kind of open up into this four-chambered capsule, and there are several birds that will eat on the berries in the fall as well. I've seen robins just kind of devouring, but the literature suggests that other songbirds, flickers, thrashers, bluebirds, if you're lucky enough to have them, and cardinals eat the fruit. And again, I would advise trying to protect it if you're getting a small one, if you have a deer problem. But again, a really nice native plant. Sharon pointed out, and I failed to mention, that the bad boy invasive species, the winter creeper and the burning bush, those are not native, whereas this one is, as is the strawberry bush. But again, you don't find it everywhere. If you're interested in this plant, it's a good, I really like it.
And then do you know how big the plants are? Have you seen them?
I haven't seen them, but I know this one, we're anticipating smaller plants.
That's what I'm thinking. So yeah, you might want to hide it for a while from the deer if you can, or fence it off a little bit to make sure you get it established. Sometimes with these, they not only do they browse on them, but they also rut on them. So when you have any of these small trees to shrubs, that could be a problem as well.
I know I have Americana, the strawberry bush, and I definitely have to put a cage around them until they get up to size so that they can tolerate some browsing. Because as you say, they're deer candy. So I was wondering if this one's as tasty to them as Americana is.
Yeah.
'Cause it's
So I don't think
pretty
so,
bad.
because you can see it's pretty, I've got a
Yeah,
probably about 15 feet tall in
Yeah.
my landscape. And again, I have lots of deer.
yeah.
So Elizabeth had mentioned Joe Pyeweed earlier in back of the rattlesnake master. This is a great plant too, a eupatorium. It's also it's synonymous with Eutrochium purpureum, and I can't even say the other one, Eupatoridelphus purpureus. But anyway, this is a really nice plant that thrives really best in light shade and moist to mesic conditions. So you don't have to have full bright sun for this guy. It occurs typically in its native sites in open woodlands and woodland borders, but it doesn't fare well in turn if the canopy is too dense. So again, if you have dappled or somewhat light shade with a little bit of sun, this is a great plant to have. It's one of the taller wildflowers found in our wooded areas, and its specific epithet, the purpureum, comes from the fact that where the leaves attach to the stem, it's a little purplish in color. The flowers are borne in these beautiful lavender-like panicles. They're compound flowers, and their nectar is attractive to a wide variety of bees, butterflies, skippers, and moths. I just show a couple of the bees here, a bicolored striped sweat bee browsing on, searching for nectar and pollen on one, and a common eastern bumblebee as well. So this is a really nice plant again. And again, the deer do seem to avoid it. So again, if you have the right conditions, this is a nice plant.
I will say about this one, Joe Pyeweed seems to be the busiest plant in my garden. It really does. If you're wanting to see, pollinators, bees, wasps, butterflies, when it's in bloom, it's incredible.
Then you clearly don't have smooth oxeye sunflower, Landon, because this or false sunflower, because this is one that, is just covered all the time.
I do, but mine is in a shaded spot.
Oh,
So
really?
yeah, it's too shady. Well, I have to move it anyway, but it flops over and it blooms okay. But yeah, it needs a better place.
Yeah. This is a similar one like Joe Pyeweed. It can get pretty big, 3 to 6 feet in height and 2 to 4 wide. So it actually pairs fairly nicely with Joe Pyeweed. This one would prefer to have more full sun if you want to really get robust blooms on it. It's a host plant for silvery checker spot butterfly and another moth species, but a lot of insects visit it. It's easy to cultivate, has a long blooming period. It's often found in and around wooded areas, which is similar to Joe Pyeweed as well, but it can be used in prairie restorations too. So as a member of the aster family, it's interesting because its flowers include both disc and ray flowers. You can see in the upper right, those are little bitty disc flowers in there. The petals come out, those are ray flowers. Both of those will produce seeds. So that's one of the things that makes it different from a true sunflower or one of the Silphium species, is the fact that both of the flower types on this complex aster head will produce seeds. In addition to that, it's a great nectar source, an armored resin bee on the lower left, a brown belted bumblebee, silvery checker spot, bottom right, again, it's a host plant for that. And then the upper right, if you aren't familiar, that's actually a camouflaged looper caterpillar. So it's a caterpillar that as it feeds along the flower head, it attaches little pieces of the flower to it to camouflage it. It's the larval form of the wavy lined emerald moth. So it's fun to sit there and watch them move around, not realizing that I know what they're up to, but the birds don't seem to bother it. So it's a fun sunflower, false sunflower to have. The flowers are held very upright, unlike in the true sunflower family where it's kind of on that nodding head. This is another way to distinguish that from sunflowers. They can be somewhat weedy. This is one of the ones that Elizabeth will mention she needs to edit it at times. So again, if you got the proper garden and the right, the desire to have it, it's a wonderful plant for attracting insects.
And you notice I still have it, even though I have to edit it. It's quite beautiful.
Oh, I'm up again.
You're up.
So, yeah, this is
Sure.
rose mallow. So I always miss this one. So this is hairy rose mallow is another name for it. Can be distinguished from some of the other hibiscus species because it does have, it's hirsute, it does have a lot of little hairs on it. It's often considered our largest native wildflower. It loves medium to wet conditions. So if you drive along the highway, you'll often see it in the ditches or in the sloughs. But it's a great plant, blooms from July into October. Each flower lasts only a day, like a lot of the hibiscus species, but it's the host plant for a number of different butterflies and moss species, which feed on the leaves and the seeds. Hummingbirds like it, in addition to long-tongued bees as well. What I'm showing here on the right, the flowers can be actually white or they can be rose-like, but it has a deep magenta red core to it. The hibiscus turret bee on the right is considered an oligolectic species in that it absolutely requires a hibiscus flower in order to collect pollen and nectar. The female bee burrows down in there, collects a lot of pollen, and takes it back. It digs a little hole in the mud, forms a little turret above it, and then it lays its egg right onto this ball of pollen. And the larva, for proper development, absolutely needs the hibiscus or a closely related flower in order to make it grow and develop properly. The male turret bee will sit on the flower and wait for the females to come around. So again, the bee is well known for that hind leg, which kind of juts out. So if you have rose mallow and you see a bee in it, look for that little leg sticking out, and it's that oligolectic turret bee.
And rose mallow, this is one that pairs well with the rose milkweed. Ned and I talked about this when we practiced, how many times we've seen, because when monarchs leave the milkweed to pupate, they usually travel 10 to 15 feet, but they find structures, to hang down from and then, pupate. And this is one where it gets so tall and it has such a nice structure that they kind of seem to me to be attracted to. And you'll just like kind of look up under the leaves, see them hanging down, and then you can kind of keep tabs on your chrysalises. So that's a fun little tidbit that I've learned along the way.
This is the oak leaf hydrangea, and it is a rather large shrub if left unpruned, easily 8 foot tall over time. And, usually when we're looking at the bloom of the oak leaf hydrangea, the large white that we might think are flowers are actually not. Those are actually bracts and the little white flowers are the little fuzzies that are behind it. And so this is brings in insects by attractiveness and scent rather than nectar and pollen. So it's interesting in its success rate. This is another plant that I like to pull up my, lawn chair and just watch all the pollinators that come to it. So honeybees, bumblebees, a lot of different kinds of flies that you really need to have a guidebook to try and figure out which ones all of them are coming to this. So this is a deciduous shrub. So right now it's just now starting to break bud, and it has very peeling bark on the stems right now. And it really kind of enjoys moist soils. So not wet soils, but really good moisture retentive soil. And it is named for its oak leaf shaped leaves that are about the size of my palm. So they're pretty good size. So if you're looking for, a good specimen statement shrub for full sun, if you have good moisture, appreciates a little bit of shade. If it's a really hot spot, like afternoon sun, it appreciates a little bit of shade for that. But it is a very long bloomer. with the bracts on it. So those stay on and those eventually dry, and they're very nice for arrangements. The plant has beautiful fall color. It's almost an oxblood red color through it before they fall, and it is deciduous. So a beautiful native hydrangea. This is another native shrub that we have called possum haw. This is actually one of our deciduous hollies, meaning that the leaves do fall off again. And so this is known both for the berries that it produces that are retained throughout the winter and are a food source for a number of small mammals and songbirds, like bluebirds, including ground birds like quail and turkey. As well. And the picture here is my husband standing at Missouri Botanical Garden. This is Missouri's champion possum haw, so that you can see the absolute maximum size that one of these will get. So this is Missouri's champion possum haw. So anywhere between 7-15 feet by 5 to 12 feet. And I've got a picture on the right that shows what the leaves look like and what the berries look like. And that picture was taken in September. And so I was just at Missouri Botanical, and there are still just a few berries left. And those will usually be taken care of by the time the new leaves come on. So this is one that's pretty good for attracting birds and the winter interest with the berries. And I will say that it's somewhat tolerant of a heavier soil, because it does like a medium moisture, and it's a good urban tree. So it's noted for being good for air pollution or city conditions.
This is copper iris. So this is native to several counties in extreme southern Illinois, and it's mostly considered a wetland wildflower, as it can tolerate even shallow water and poorly drained clay soil. So I noticed there were a couple of comments about turtlehead and not being able to do well in clay soils. This is very close in proximity to my turtlehead that I have growing there. In fact, it's right next to that little creeklet that I mentioned. So, so it can tolerate, again, clay soils, but also can actually tolerate wet feet all the time. It blooms from May to June. It'll get 2 to 3 feet tall and 1 to 2 feet wide. It's really highly valued because of its unique color. So it does very well throughout the state of Illinois, albeit native, as I mentioned, just to southern Illinois. And it's actually in its native terrain is considered to be quite threatened. So the larvae, several moths reportedly feed on its leaves and seeds, and hummingbirds and a few bees also are attracted to its nectar. The center lower picture is actually up right next to my road, to the street that I live on. So it's not down in the water, and still it blooms and does well there. So it doesn't have to be that wet. Again, with global warming and all the storms, I don't know what wet and dry is anymore some of these years, but the flower's been blooming in both of those places for me. And there is some color variation. Elizabeth's picture is on the lower left, and it's a little more reddish in color. But again, this is a lovely plant, given its beautiful and unique color, and it's copper iris.
You know, Ned, where I have mine planted, I have mine where the rain flows off of my property. I have this at a bottom of a hill where it gets a lot of water flow. And so it does very well. And I think I mentioned to you that I had let a redbud seedling, volunteer seedling grow, and it started casting shade, and my flowering started going downhill on this. So this really does like more sun for maximum bloom. So I've cut down my redbud just for this plant. It's worth it. It's quite beautiful and rare in the trade.
Yep.
So, you know, Ned and I talked about whether to include this one or not, and we decided that, you know, even though for the most part it has a tendency to be short-lived, let's call it a short-lived perennial, because it's fussy in what conditions it needs to grow. This is the cardinal flower. This is Lobelia cardinalis. It is a full sun plant, part shade, at most. So it really likes full sun. It is a medium to wet. And so when we talk about this particular plant, it should never be in dry soil. So those soils that go from wet to dry, that just really shortens its life. It needs to be in consistently moist to wet soils that never dry out. When it's in a tappy place, it can last for a number of years, but if it is in a condition where it dries out, that has a tendency to make it somewhat short-lived. The plants are usually easily 3 to 4 foot tall. Rarely do I see them at the 2 foot level. They're usually closer to that 4 foot level. Absolutely adored by hummingbirds, swallowtails of several different kinds, and you'll see bumblebees on these as well. But one of the things that's interesting about where we live is red is somewhat of an unusual color. If you think about, how many red plants do we have that are not annuals, that are just this screaming red color. And so I'm with Ned on this, that, if I can provide it with wet conditions as much as possible, even if I have to plant it every other year or every third year, or something like that, just to keep it, this is a stunningly beautiful plant to have in the garden. And it's really, I don't know if it's, because people have gotten to the mindset that, our nurseries, don't want to deal with it. It's kind of nice that it's being offered for sale in the sale, to be able to put it out, but just stunningly beautiful.
And here's another stunner. Again, this is Virginia bluebells, which most of you are probably familiar with. It's considered obviously a woodland wildflower. It's a herbaceous perennial plant that'll bloom for about 3 weeks from mid-spring, getting closer. In a couple of weeks, it should be in pretty much in full bloom. Its buds open on the lower left. You can see they're typically pinkish, and then they turn into a lavender and then into a brilliant blue. It doesn't appear to be, from the sources that I looked, to be a host plant for anything that I could determine. Hummingbirds and many insects will visit it primarily for nectar, but also for pollen as well. It prefers a moist to medium area with a richer, more loamy soil, and matures quickly in the spring. Once the danger of frost passes, it'll mature very quickly, bloom, and then it disappears by mid-June. It is rooted by a taproot, but the plant often spreads into colonies via the many small nutlet seeds that it puts out. But it is a true spring ephemeral. So what you buy now, again, if pickup date is what, May 8th, correct, Landon? That might be a little too late. I doubt if those plants are going to bloom. So be sure to mark it well wherever you put it, because by the middle of June, it'd be gone. So, so a lot of people end up planting on top of it. This is my backyard. I don't have much of a backyard, but the bluebells are happy there and I absolutely love them. So I just let them go wild. They seed freely. And then, like I mentioned, whatever you have planted, ferns or what else, are do well in the same environment. Come the middle of June, these guys will all be dried up and gone, and your other plants will come popping through. Again, I have deer. I had a fawn born in the backyard last year, and I have bluebells. So the deer don't seem to bother them to any real extent, at least not in my garden. So that's Virginia bluebells. On the picture before that, there is a variation. There are white and there are pink ones too. I'm lucky enough, I have several of the white ones blooming in my garden. And I'm in the wild, I've seen pink ones as well, but I haven't managed to grab one of them yet. So that's Virginia bluebells.
That's definitely a plant that I have never edited one of them out. I keep
Exactly.
every one that I get, every one of them.
Yep, yeah.
So that was blooming. One of those pictures said April 3rd. When's the earliest you've ever seen?
Pardon me? It'll be red. It's like I say, mine are about 6 to 8 inches tall now. And now with all the rain, in a couple days, when the sun comes out, it's fast because it's got to be done. It doesn't like the hot, dry summer. So it really gets going.
And the flush and new foliage is a lot of times tinged a beautiful purplish color too.
Right, yeah, right
really
now
neat.
it says a perch. And it's also considered a nice habitat for that month or so when a lot of the critters are coming out as well. It provides a lot of protection for them in a woodland setting. So one of my favorite plants for sure. This is another one I like. This is a wild bergamot or eastern bee balm. So it's one of the Monarda species, also known as Bradbury's bee balm. Illinois Wildflower website considers it to be more of a savanna or thicket wildflower that actually prefers partial sun and somewhat dry conditions in order to survive. The blooms actually start in the center as a small wreath of little flowers that gradually work their way out to the edge as the season develops. It's one of the earlier bee balms to bloom. It'll bloom late spring into early summer over a period about a month. The flowers don't seem to have much of a scent, but the leaves, if you crush them, smells a little bit like oregano. Two ways to distinguish this Monarda, actually 3 ways from some of the others, is it's a shorter stature plant, so it only gets 1 to 2 feet tall. In the middle on the bottom, I have the lower lip of the flowers are spotted on here. And also the leaves to the right, they're attached in a sessile fashion directly to the stem. So those are 2 good ways to distinguish this, again, as I mentioned, from some of the other bee balms. Hummingbirds and a number of assorted insects visit it for nectar, but also a few to collect pollen. It doesn't seem to be overly aggressive either. Some people shy away from the Monardas and the bee balms because they're a little aggressive, like Fistulosa and Didyma can be somewhat aggressive, but this guy isn't. So anyway, Eastern bee balm.
I'm going to show you another grass. This is a taller grass. So this is our switchgrass, the panicum. This is a full sun and maybe some part shade and anywhere from medium to wet soil. So definitely not on the dry side for this one. And it can get some height on it, anywhere usually 6 feet tall. I'm showing you some of the native vars of this. There's quite a bit of variety in here. Northwind is probably a very common one. The native switchgrass, when you're ordering it, will look very similar to Northwind, except for it will have a pinkish cast to the flower and seed head on there, rather than this silvery color of Northwind. And so again, like the other grasses that I've included here, this is a host plant for a number of skippers throughout Illinois. And it also, the seeds are an important seed source again for a lot of wetland birds and some other graniferous birds. So if you're looking for, habitat for birds and butterflies, you always want to consider adding grasses as well. They're good additions. So this one's a big one. So it is a nice screen for the back of plantings. So anywhere where you need a filler, it has a beautiful coloration to match up against some of our bigger perennials. So go ahead, Lennon.
So taking all that into consideration, this is one that we're also offering as a plug. A lot of people like to put in that nice row of grass in their property to serve as a screen. So this is a good option for that.
Most definitely. So this is switchgrass. This one's definitely not very commonly offered. You pretty much have to go to a native plant sale to get wild quinine. And so this is a member of the sunflower family. It is a full sun plant. I would say that it probably prefers a drier, and again, I'll go back to a well-drained soil as opposed to a moisture retentive soil. It's that mid-range size, anywhere from 2 to 4 feet. Has beautiful, I'm going to call them woolly looking white flowers that are kind of a flat dome of woolly looking white flowers. And so it makes really nice cut, both fresh and dried. And it has a fragrance to it too, that is just kind of pleasing to walk along. And so I would say that this one's, because it, likes well drained, it's fairly drought resistance, does well in kind of shallow rocky soil. I have it in some clay and it seems to be doing fairly well in clay as well. Where I'm at, it dries out. And so it seems to do quite well. This is visited by a lot of pollinators. So flies are the big ones and wasp are the other ones. So a number of wasps and flies will visit this. So this is another, when you look at colors, there's usually in the pinks and the purples a lot of times, and having something that is uniquely white is a nice addition to a mixed planting. So this is wild quinine.
Okay, we're going back into the woodland again. This is woodland phlox, or a wild sweet William, Phlox divaricata. As the name implies, it's what I would consider to be an essential spreading perennial wildflower for the woodland. Fairly adaptable, however, but it does require medium moisture and well-drained, typically humusy soils. It tolerates shade to part shade conditions, so it doesn't have to be as full shade as Virginia bluebells, for instance. The flowers are born in the spring, mid-spring to early summer, and they're on the end of a terminal cluster, rounded cluster of flowers. Color variations occur quite a bit. I'm showing you 3 different color variations in my garden. I'm starting to be a little bit worried that I'm a contrarian species, because I had the white utyberry, I had the white phlox, and I also had the white bluebell. So a little worried about that, but it is what it is. So these, the color variations are normal and they do occur. The plants are considered to be stoloniferous, so they will spread a little bit. They have vegetative growth, and the flowers appear on these floral shoots, but sometimes the vegetative growth can persist all the way into winter time. So this, unlike the Virginia bluebells, this is a plant that does not typically disappear. And it also, it's essentially, the flowers are essentially self-infertile. So they actually do require some cross-pollination to occur. Several species of butterflies, moths, and bees are important for that cross-pollination. So it's a good plant, again, for the pollinators. In addition, if you're going to buy one of these plants, you probably want to buy several due to the fact that they will be self-unfertile. Unlike the bluebells, again, as I mentioned, the leaves can be retained into the fall season. So a beautiful plant, a sweet smelling plant as well, wild sweet William.
And this is one that we are selling plugs of as well.
Oh, great. So
yeah, because it needs more to pollinate, and then also it's just a nice woodland spreader.
Right.
It's definitely beautiful, naturalized throughout if you have a wooded
Right.
area. So unlike the woodland phlox, the garden phlox is a full sun to only part shade. So it does best in full sun. In fact, its susceptibility to powdery mildew, it's probably a little bit better if you do have it in sun, and manage the planting so that it doesn't become too dense. And so there's some editing. I do some editing on this just to thin it down to make sure that I maintain good airflow and good rapid drying conditions, because this is one that is susceptible to powdery mildew, like some of the monardas are as well, but this one definitely is. And so this usually has a really long bloom season. July through September is not uncommon on my property. Plants are usually mine are probably in that 2 to 3 foot, but I have seen them taller on a better site. A lot of pollinators come to this, butterflies and skippers, and I've seen hummingbird moths and sphinx moths on these as well. So again, just a beautiful phlox and a taller one. So like Ned said, with the woodland phlox, this also has some variation in color. This is probably on the brighter, hotter end of garden phlox. Some of them are a lighter pink than this as well. So you can get some variation, some lighter and some darker. So This is a very fragrant flower. So when you're walking, you know, like dusk or early in the morning, when the air is heavy, you can definitely smell this. And it is, I would say, fairly tolerant to things like black walnut. So if you've got a sunny place that's adjacent to black walnut, this is would be tolerant of something like that as well. You know, one of my favorite, excuse me, one of my favorite woodland plants is mayapple. And so this is one that's a part shade to full shade. And probably these like umbrella leaves get to a height of maybe a foot to a foot and a half tall. Plants are usually single stem, or they'll have one that'll angle off, and the ones that angle off will have a little flower in that branch angle, as you see in the picture here, which will transition to a little berry. And I noticed on Illinois Wildflower, it was suggested that box turtles will feed on these little berries, and possibly possums, raccoons, and skunks as well. And so this might have some usefulness to wildlife as well. But it's known as being a host plant to the golden borer moth as well. And pollinators like bumblebees and other long-tongued bees will visit these beautiful little flowers. And this is kind of, you know, like the wild ginger. They both have beautiful flowers, but they're hidden by the foliage. So you actually have to get down on your, you know, down low and lift up the leaves to actually see the flowers. But usually the flowers are, well, probably in the next couple of weeks, they should be in bloom. Mine are starting to come up. So I took this picture at one time on March 30th. So anytime in the late March to early April probably is when these are going to be in bloom. So
And
again,
this is one that you're not going to probably ever find in a plant store, or really a plant sale hardly. So
yeah,
if
it's fairly uncommon to get this. They will spread, but not with any speediness on them. So, you know, if you want to have a nice stand like what's shown here, you're going to want to get several of them to get the process going, because it takes a while for them to really get a nice little colony.
so
going
that's
from this.
we're actually selling these in plugs too.
Oh, wonderful. See, that's what you need. If you want to get a colony, you want to plant lots of them.
If you have a woodland area that you've cleared out, all the honeysuckle, all the euonymus and all of that, I mean, in this plant sale, you can really fill your space with some really cool stuff. But this is one of my favorite plants.
There's a question in the question and answer section regarding the yellowish brownish spots that typically appear. Is that just something you got to live with? I know I see that as well. I thought it was a fungus, but the submitter says it's a virus. But it often attacks my mayaples. I know.
Yeah, I don't do anything about mine. It doesn't seem to, you know, reduce its population. Off the top of my head, I don't know exactly, you know, what all the possibilities are, but mine usually look fairly healthy. And
yeah, usually it's later in the summer, I think.
yeah,
and they come back like gangbusters. So
I don't usually
worry about them.
You know, I have some Asian varieties too, and they get little crispy spots on them, you know, as well, and they come back every year as well. So this is this one definitely is not very common. This is Jacob's ladder, or Greek valerian is another name, and this is a sun to part shade. And I'm going to say that if you have good soil moisture, it'll take full sun. If you have a little bit of drying, you're probably going to want to have a little bit of protection from the hottest part of the sun if you have that option. This plant looks best to me planted in mass. So Landon, I don't know how you're selling this one, but get several so that you can, you know, at least three or four or five, so that you can have a nice mass of them. This is the other flower that I mentioned, you know, when I was talking about Amsonia, this is the other one that has like storm cloud bluish purple, white flowers, just kind of just a beautiful calming color to them. And so these plants are, a foot to 1.5 feet tall, very cut foliage with the beautiful flower clusters on the top of them. This is a whole host plant for a leaf miner. Here we're talking a lot of time about host plants for butterflies and so forth. And this one is, the larval form is one of the leaf miners. It's pollinated by a number of the bees, honeybees, bumblebees, small carpenter bees. You can see all those that I've listed there. But it's also visited by a number of other insects like flies and butterfly skippers and moths that are there for collecting nectar. And so this is a really nice plant for naturalizing because it is very showy. Another one that deer don't seem to go after. So this, if you have a lot of deer pressure, this is one that doesn't get munched on as much. And it's also known to be tolerant of black walnut as well. So, when we're mentioning this one, if it's in its happy place, will self-seed. So some editing may be needed if you get it in a really premium or optimal conditions.
Yeah, that one we're not selling in plugs, but maybe next time we could sell it in plugs. I like the foliage a lot on it. It almost is fern-like.
Yes.
And I tried to get it to grow a few times and I haven't been able to find its happy place. That's one of my big disappointments on gardening. So I think I might get some this time and try to find its happy place again.
Yeah, uniform moisture. It likes to be in uniformly moist.
So Landon mentioned earlier the unfortunate circumstance that a lot of these wonderful plants are considered weeds. So butterfly weed or milkweed or pickerel weed or ironweed. I don't consider them weeds. This is a beautiful Pontidaria cordata pickerel weed. It's actually considered an emergent aquatic plant. That means that its roots like to be in the mud, in the muck, and if it's growing on a pond edge or whatever in a wetland, then the foliage comes up above the water and the flower is born on top of that. This will get 2 to 4 feet tall and a couple feet wide, but it also is an aggressive spreader. So if you have an area that you would like to plant this, if you have a little wetland area or a little water garden, for instance, it's advised that you plant this in pots and submerge them because it will be aggressively spreading. Larvae of several moth species and a beetle feed on its leaves, and it's pollinated by a number of butterflies, skippers, hummingbirds. I've actually tried to grow this. These pictures are not from my garden. These are from the gardens over at Bellefontaine Cemetery and Arboretum. But they have quite an extensive little area with a little stream flowing through it and some wetlands there. And this does really well there. And it's just covered, swarming all the time with bees. There's a brown belted, a bicolored sweat bee again. The European wool carder bee is actually an invasive bee from Europe. Like the Western honeybee, it's not a native bee, but again, it is attracted to this pickerel weed. The Plant Finder website considers it a viable candidate for a rain garden, but I have to disagree with that because typically a rain garden, when well constructed, is dry between rainfalls. So it'll hold water for 24 hours or less. So this would not be a good plant for a rain garden. It would be if you had a bog garden or some sort of water garden that actually holds water. Again, the individual flowers, they're born, they last only a day or two, but that flower spike can go up to 3 feet tall, and it blooms for an extensive period of time from June into October. So this is pickerel weed. Also, the eggs of dragonflies and damsel flies, they like to lay their eggs on the foliage. And the seeds are edible when off of the plant or when they're dried. So pickerel weed. And this is Chickasaw plum. This, I'm really excited that that HeartLands is offering this. I actually Have several of them that I bought from, I think from Oklahoma and from the Florida Panhandle as well. This is more of, it is a native to Illinois. The indigenous Chickasaw Indians and other indigenous tribes actually grew this and used it for fresh fruit or dried the fruit into winter time. It's a prunus species, so it's host to a number of different larvae, coral hairstreak, tiger swallowtail, spring azure, viceroy butterfly, and also red spotted purples. This is a red admiral here that's feeding on the nectar of it. It blooms early, so the picture I have there is April 16th, and then the fruit is ripe. If you're lucky enough to get the fruit, they ripen either to this yellow or reddish, but the critters love them. I don't know who's eating them, but I thought it was going to be a bumper crop last year, and that's the one that I got. So anyway, a lot of bees are known to suck nectar or collect pollen from them as well. This is a good plant. It does tend to put up suckers that you need to trim out if you want to. Otherwise, for like a riparian buffer area or a wet stream bank stabilization or something, I think this would be an ideal plant in that setting. It gets to up to 15 feet tall and 4 to 5 feet wide. But again, a preferred prunus species for attracting a lot of different larvae to it. I wouldn't consider this a landscape plant, so I wouldn't plant this as a standalone specimen tree because it is prone to a number of different either critters or dieback or a fungal attack, for instance, but a little disfigurement in a riparian setting or in a border area is okay. But I wouldn't plant it in the middle of my yard, although I would plant it instead of a Bradford pear. Editorial comment. And another tree. So this is a great tree. This is our state tree of Illinois. It's in Doug Tallamy's Nature's Best Hope. It's one of the ones he refers to as a keystone plant regarding its role in sustaining the local ecology. It's the primary species for doing that in 84% of the US counties. Michael Durr in his Encyclopedia of Trees and Shrubs says, the white oak is the standard by which all other oaks are measured. And that's because it's really a beautiful tall species that, you know, the acorns feed a lot of wildlife, but in our area, it's considered that about 350 to 400 different Lepidoptera, and that's again the butterflies and the moths, their caterpillars use it to forage on it. A lot of times, there was a professor at one of the recent Southern Illinois Native Plant Society meetings, a professor from U of I presented the book on the lower right, talking about the wasps that feed on the caterpillars there and the different caterpillars there. A lot of times you need to go way up into the canopy to even see what's eating on there, but a big supporter of the butterflies and moths and therefore the birds. So it's a great plant, a great tree to have. Again, the best time to plant a white oak was probably 20 years ago, and the second best time is tomorrow. So if you are so into it and have a spot for it, prefers dry to medium conditions, full sun. It doesn't want to be transplanted after you plant it, and it doesn't want to be in too much shade, but please consider planting an oak tree.
Get one for your mom for Mother's Day. The plant sale pickup is the day before, so it's the best gift.
There you go.
Ned, did you know Doug Tallamy has a new book coming out? And I think oak is his featured subject.
I heard, and there's many of you probably seen, there's a webinar series next week out of Ohio State, and I think Doug Tallamy's on Monday morning at 9 o'clock. So I'm signed up. Uh-oh, me again. Yes. This is sweet coneflower. This is a Rudbeckia species. It tolerates full sun to part shade. So I have it again along that little creeklet, so which gets considerable amount of shade there. And you can see the water behind it. So it is one of the ones that will tolerate some wetland spaces. The silvery checker spot butterfly is attracted to it, as well as several moss species, and numerous sorted insects will pollinate it. It's one that it seems to be more common further north in the state of Illinois, and it's found in a wide variety of habitats, actually, from prairies to savanna to woodland borders to seeps or to stream banks like I'm showing it here. Illinois Wildflowers website actually states that its fidelity to any particular habitat is low. So that tells me that it's a nice plant for most of us to consider, from full sun to part shade, and no particular fidelity to any other type of landscape. So, and it's also considered to be longer lived than either the black-eyed Susans or the brown-eyed Susans. It will get 3 to 5 feet tall if it's happy, and it will branch and produce a bigger. This was a new plant here, so I don't have a real mature plant yet, but another nice plant. So sweet coneflower.
You know, Ned, I have one of the cultivated varieties, Henry Eilers, and it dropped a number of seeds and it reverted back to its natural. And so
Oh, really?
so I have all these little seedlings around that are not quilled petals. They're back to this standard sweet coneflower petal. Quite pretty.
Yeah.
So I have the next one. And so, you know, this is a hairy wild petunia, or just wild petunia. And this is a plant that some have reported to me that is rather aggressive on their property, and they have to do quite a bit of editing on this one. It behaves where I have it fairly well. This is a full sun to part shade. It really is probably on the dry side to average soil. Definitely prefers to be a little bit drier rather than having wet feet. It is a plant that has a tendency to grow up and then kind of fall over. So if you want it to be upright, it'd have to be staked. But mine has a tendency to just kind of sprawl on the ground, just like a regular cultivated petunia does. So it's probably anywhere from that 18 to 24 inches tall. This is a host plant for the common buckeye, and thank you, Ned, for including a picture of a buckeye so they can see what it looks like. But it also has a number of other pollinators, including some bees and flies. So this is a plant that, because it is dry to medium on the upper slopes of a rain garden, not down in the water, but on the upper slopes, it will do well. It's one of the smaller plants, so you don't want to get tall plants in front of it, or it'll just kind of disappear on you. But it is rather showy. So this is, you know, you can see the colors of the flowers here. This is probably one of the darker versions on it. And I've seen these much lighter, but they're all kind of in this lavender type of color. But this is a really good for if you have shallow rocky ground as well, and more on the dry side. So this is our wild petunia.
So we saw pickerelweed earlier, which was considered an emergent aquatic plant. This is as well. So this is arrowleaf, also known as broad arrowhead or duck potato. It prefers full sun and wet conditions. And similar to as the pickerelweed, it can well tolerate having wet feet and being submerged even in a mucky environment. I actually, the pickerelweed that I tried to grow in my little creeklet didn't do very well. I think it wasn't sunny enough, so I didn't get any, I never got any blooms from that. However, this is actually sited in the same spot. So that tells me, at least under my conditions, that it tolerates a little less full sun than the pickerelweed does. And the flowers, the inflorescence is actually, in preparing for this, I was reading up on them. And the flowers are actually born, you can see 3 in a whorl around each stem. And they're typically, this plant is monoecious, so it has both male and female flowers. And typically you'll have a whorl of female flowers, the next whorl will be male flowers. I didn't know that. I need to pay more attention to it next time. Sometimes there are perfect flowers as well, but anyway, it's a nice brightly colored little wetland plant if you have the proper place for it. I think it can tolerate drier conditions. It definitely doesn't need to be submerged in water like the pickerelweed prefers to be. And again, as I mentioned, it tolerates a little less full sun. There's a species of cutworm, a dartmouth, that apparently uses its foliage, but a number of insect visitors will sample the nectar and also collect or feed on the pollen. It's stoloniferous, so it will spread, but not nearly as aggressively as the pickerel weed will. For instance, it's also called duck potato because some of these stolons will terminate in a tuber, like a potato-like tuber. And ducks and wildfowl love the seeds that are produced as well as these tubers as well. So if you have the proper place for it, again, you won't see this offered very many places. You have to go to a water garden place usually to get both pickerel weed and arrowleaf. So I'm going to buy some more. This is blue sage. So this is one of our only, I believe there are only 2 native Illinois salvias, this one and another one. This is typically seen more in open prairie-like areas, full sun, dry to medium. I took these pictures down at the Babler Educational Farm south of Waterloo. If you've never been down there, they have some wonderful prairie areas and also pollinator gardens. So this was in the pollinator garden down there. So beautiful tall plant. It'll get up to 3 to 5 feet tall. And it terminates in these beautiful spires of flowers here. The American bumblebee that's flying in, that's a male. You can tell by all the little white, the yellow on its abdominal area. And honing in, it's considered actually in many parts of the country to be a threatened species. So it's indicative of a nice, really a fertile, good, nice habitat down there at the Babler Farm. So get yourself down there sometime and go exploring. It's really a nice place to visit. It's a host plant, the blue sage, for the sage sphinx moth, as noted there. But a number of bees visit it for nectar, as do monarchs and regal fritillaries as well, but they're considered to be non-pollinating in general. Also, I should add that this is declining in the state of Illinois, the blue sage. It's found more to the west, Missouri, Nebraska, etc. But at least in Illinois, it's been declining because of habitat destruction. So a nice plant that you might want to co-plant it with other tall species, because if it doesn't have enough sun or enough support around it, it will tend to flop a little bit. And I think, Elizabeth, that's been your experience too, right?
Yeah, stake it.
And it's one of the only blue wildflowers that we have too, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, this is elderberry, and this particular one was a selection out of the Missouri elderberry program, where they were looking for local elderberries that were very productive in the Midwest. So this is wildwood, and you can see the size of the flowers. I got these pictures from Pat Byers, who is one of the leads on the elderberry project in Missouri for the extension component. And so with elderberry, the flowers can be used for making syrups and liqueurs. I commonly collect my flowers when they're first open and make them as a syrup, and they're really nice, you know, in waters and just for flavoring of things. But if you leave them go to transition to berries, then the berries, as you see in the far right picture, are used for juices and jams and other food stuff like that traditional berries would be used for. And so this is a rather large shrub that will do equally well in full sun. I have mine in part shade in that it does not get the hot afternoon sun. So it gets sun in the morning and somewhat shaded in the afternoon, and it does quite well with that type. So it needs to have sufficient soil moisture. This is not one for dry, so medium to wet. It is a host plant for a number of moths that I have listed here, and it is visited by a number of pollinators. So this is kind of a busy plant when it is in bloom. So not only do I enjoy the berries and the flowers, but also birds and certain rodents and also squirrels will eat any of the shattered berries that drop to the ground on there. So this is a nice large berry producing plant. I will say that if you have deer, this seems to be a plant on my property that is racked every year. And so I probably lose, you know, half of the canes every year just from bucks coming in and breaking them off. But this is a pretty vigorous plant, and it recovers from it every year and does very well. So this is a plant that if you have a good sized rain garden, this would do well in the rain garden. As I say, the flowers are showy and fragrant and very attractive to birds when they're in the berry stage. So if you're looking for something big, wildwood specifically adapted for berry production in the Midwest is a good opportunity for you to get one.
And I did read on this one, on the elderberry, that it's good for stream bank stabilization. I guess a lot of people use it for that too.
That's what I actually am using mine for. I have an area that I need to stabilize, and that's where I have my elderberry as well. So definitely. This next plant is probably my favorite of the skullcaps. There are a number of different skullcaps. I have some skullcaps that are native that are in my crevice garden or rock garden that, you know, hug the ground really, really small. This is one that likes dry to average soil as well, but it's a much taller plant. So this is anywhere from 2 to 3 foot tall and really has a beautiful terminal inflorescence on it that's this beautiful light lavender color. And so this plant is visited by bumblebees, and on numerous occasions I have seen the hummingbird moth visit this plant as well. And so this is one that's for full sun to part shade. And if you really like skullcaps, this one is not as aggressive as a spreader as some of the other ones that you might have. So this one's a little bit more polite than some of the other skullcaps. So this one's pretty good for droughtier areas, drier clay, dry soil would be a good siting for it. So this is the hoary or the downy skullcap. You know, when we were going through theirs, every time I see this plant, I always say, make way for Lola. This is just, you know, a pretty impressively tall plant. And so this is the prairie dock. This is one of the silphiums. And I'm going to say that prairie dock is not that common as well, because, you know, it's a really large plant. So not every, you know, small garden can take a plant this large. And so the leaves are rather large, almost like banana leaves. You can see my hand in the center upper picture, the relationship size of my hand to what the leaves, and those are held at the base of the plant. And the flower stalks then are generated and easily go 8 to 10 foot tall and are topped by small little sunflower type flowers, yellow on the top. And so this has another specialist moth, the silphium moth, that utilizes it as a host plant. It is in the Asteraceae family, so it is visited like many in the family by the bees and the different butterflies and so forth, and also the ruby-throated hummingbird. And this is another one I mentioned with the echinacea, the pale purple coneflower. This is another one that you will see goldfinches when the seeds come on the flower heads, goldfinches really visiting this flower. And so you can get an idea of the size of this by the picture on the far right. This is a friend at the end of a walkway that is lined with these plants. And so it can be a rather impressive plant when it is got its full flower stalk and inflorescence in bloom. From experience, we've talked about this, wherever you plant this, make sure that's where you want it. This is incredibly deep, tap rooted, that once it gets in the ground, it's very, very difficult, if not impossible, to move it. So this is one that I will tell you that wherever you decide to put it, And if it's happy there, just leave it there. The picture on the left, I took at Missouri Botanical, and they have it just sitting out in full sun as a specimen, and it's just lovely, the way they've used it with the rocks around it. I'm jealous, Ned, that you have this next one. So that's the prairie dock.
And that pathway was leading back into the woods, because here we've got Indian pink again, which is
Oh,
considered to be a woodland wildflower. However, I don't really think it's as much of a woodland wildflower as some of the others, the Virginia bluebells or even the woodland phlox, because mine here, which is blooming on the right, that's pretty much in almost as full a sun as I have. You see the butterfly weed is blooming down next to it as well. So I think at least in my hands, it's a bit of a misnomer, because I have this also planted in the deep shade where the bluebells, the phlox, etc., have done well. And it doesn't bloom nearly as nicely as it does when it gets some sun. So again, the Plant Finder says part to full shade. I kind of discount that a bit and find that it does need more sun. But it's a beautiful flower. It's a stunning flower wherever it is. The showy flowers, they're actually born in a raceme, which consists of, you can see in Elizabeth's picture on the lower left, you typically have 2 to 10 flowers that appear as shown on the upper side of this, this little flowering raceme, kind of in held though, however, in an erect fashion onto the plant. The bloom period typically starts in late spring and extends into early summer, lasting about a month or so. The roots are considered fibrous but also rhizomatous, and so that the colonies do spread a little bit, but certainly not aggressively at all. The deer maybe I'll taste at it a little once in a while, but largely won't go back to it because it's considered to be toxic. It has some alkaloids and some calcium oxalate crystals in it as well. So it won't be a favorite plant of the deer. So you can pretty much plant it where you have deer. Again, it's growing where I have a lot of deer. So there's very little known about any floral faunal relationships. I certainly couldn't find any. But the hummingbirds, it's considered, along with the buckeye at the beginning of the presentation, as one of those harbingers of the hummingbird return. And they love to visit it primarily for its nectar, obviously. It's a native to further south in the state, but given its beauty, it's planted throughout the state now. And it's the only known member of its family, the Logania family, which Elizabeth has put in the upper right-hand corner, if you haven't noticed, on all of these, the family names. So I know Landon's recording this. If you ever go back and look at it, for instance, the Pulmonium is in the phlox family. So a lot of these fall within the same families to one another. But this is the beautiful Indian pink.
I have to agree with you, Ned. I don't have any in full shade. At most, I have part shade on mine. So mine actually get quite a bit of sun.
Sun as well. So yeah.
So I think this might be the last grass that we're going to talk about. And so this is prairie dropseed. And this is one of the smaller ones. Again, this is probably 2 to 3 foot tall. And as you can see, this is really has a fountain growth habit to it. So this is full sun, dry to average soil. And the seeds are very important for granivorous birds, again, like our field sparrows, Savannah sparrows, American tree sparrow, the dark-eyed junco, all of our little native seed-eating birds. And so I would say that this is fairly easy to grow as long as you have dry to average soil. It really doesn't appreciate being in wet feet. And so this can be used for naturalizing, but it can also be used, I've seen it used wonderfully for lining walkways or driveways or, forming paths and so forth. And so again, if you're looking, for mixed planting and want to incorporate some grass, the prairie dropseed has a really nice fountain shape to it that starts out green, and as fall comes on, it matches the landscape and takes on this beautiful, dried grass look. So it is really quite attractive for season long. Ned, you got another great one.
I know, this is a beauty. This is celandine or wood poppy. So it's purported to, again, in the literature to like the same conditions as Indian pink, but I find that this one really does prefer the part to full shade. So where it really thrives in under medium to wet conditions. It blooms earlier than Indian pink from April into June. So it kind of comes on right at the tail end of the bluebells, right when the phlox and we aren't offering the spiderworts, but the spiderworts are starting to bloom then too. And has a fairly extended bloom time from April into June. The flowers are either born singly or in a little flower head here. Beautiful yellow flowers that are born. Beetles are known to visit the flowers, but very little is known about any other floral faunal relationships again with this. However, unlike the phlox, which was self-infertile, these will self-pollinate one another. So even though pollinators will visit, as I mentioned, this guy is perfectly happy making its own seeds. Because of that, and because of the fact that the seeds have a little an oily fringe to them, which ants really like. It's a nutritional source for these ants, and they'll take them back to their ant hills and their colonies and then eat the little oily fringe, and the seeds will germinate. So if you have one of these, it's again, you don't have to buy multiple ones. I guess I shouldn't say that. But anyway, it will self-seed and it will spread around. To the fact that actually some people feel that these are somewhat weedy. I don't, because they're so beautiful, but I have been known to pull these, whereas I won't pull a bluebell. So anyway, and the other thing is they have an attractive foliage actually that sometimes lasts pretty long into the season. And even you might once in a while get a rebloom on some of these. So deer only browse it sparingly, again, has some toxicity apparently, but they largely leave it alone. So that's celandine or wood poppy. It also, if you crush the leaves or if you break the stem, it bleeds yellowish orange. So unlike bloodroot, which bleeds red, this one's a yellow sap that comes out. So it's kind of a fun one if you're playing around with it to break that off and look at it. So that's
I've had a number of these reseed in some really hot sunny areas, and the leaves kind of get ratty looking, and they're kind of in, right in where I don't want something to look ratty like that, and I can cut them back, and they come right back in the fall and come right back in the spring. So even if they're ratty looking, they take a while to cut them back. So this is one of my favorite ones. This is Culver's root, Veronicastrum virginicum, and this is another one of the taller ones. And I believe the one that HeartLands is offering will be the straight species or the white one. There are some natural selections though that run to the purple, and I'm showing a picture with a hummingbird moth visiting this one. I think this might be Diane. But they usually run from a white to maybe slightly purple. And so this can easily, if they're in their happy spot, easily be 4 foot anywhere up to 7 feet tall. Average to wet soil is probably their preference. They will spread. So if you have one, they have good vertical height for a mixed planting, or if you need to back something with some height in a bed. They do provide that. Their flowers are, to me, candelabra in how they spread. And over time, I've got several different pictures here from June 29th, July 7th. They really kind of have a long bloom period. When they go to seed then is when they really look, start making you realize that they're in the plantain family. They start looking more like a plantain when the flowers go to seed at that point. And so this is a host plant for a specialist, again, the Culver root borer, and it's visited by a number of pollinators, as I've already shown in a picture, that the hummingbird moths really like it, but also the long-tongued and the short-tongued bees. And I've seen thread-waisted wasp and a number of other butterflies and moths visit these as well. And so again, really nice for something like a rain garden, very showy and tolerant of a wetter soil.
This is prairie ironweed, a Vernonia species, also known as dwarf common or smooth ironweed. Its best conditions are full sun and medium to wet. Blooms late in the season, typically from July into September. It's a nice Vernonia because it's shorter than some of the others, like Missouriensis, for instance, can get up to 7 feet tall. This one's only 2 to 4 feet and 1.5 to 3 feet wide. It's a host plant for American painted lady and painted lady caterpillars, as well as another borer moth. And a wide variety of insects visit for nectar or to collect pollen. I'm really excited about this being offered because you never see it. Missouri Botanical Garden Plant Finder, for instance, doesn't even have an image of it, which is unusual. So, according to what I've read, it has the same magenta colored flower. These are 3 other Vernonias that I currently grow, and they all have that similar flower appearance with different shades of magenta to deep magenta. This plant, the prairie ironweed itself, is typically found further north in Illinois than what we have here, but it's also more often found in wetland habitats. So I'm really looking forward to growing it where I have some of the other plants in somewhat less of full sun, but moisture conditions. The ironweeds in general will cross hybridize a lot. So a lot of time it's difficult to really know exactly which species you have. But if you like ironweeds, this one's not a very common one and hopefully would fit nicely into your garden as well. I put my order in yesterday.
I ordered one too, Ned.
All right.
I've never seen it before.
Oh,
So
yeah.
I was kind of excited to order it too.
I
Well,
ordered
Ned,
the prairie dock. I thought, I haven't been able to find that anywhere.
it's not very common. Well, Ned, you started us off and I'm going to do the last one. And so this is the Meadow Zizia or the Golden Alexander. And this is the heart-leaved one. So instead of the cut leaf of the other Golden Alexander, Zizia aptera, has heart-shaped leaves or little arrowhead type leaves. And so this is a small little plant. This is, a foot, maybe to 3 foot, but it has a tendency to kind of spread out and flatten a little bit. I have several different plants and some of them are shorter and some of them are taller depending on where they're at. I have areas where they're, in fairly moist soil. And then I had one pop up in my crevice garden where it's definitely not moist and it seems to be doing equally well in both locations. And so the plant finder says that this blooms in May. You can see that I took this picture on April 20th. So I'm not quite in agreement with their bloom window. I consider this a very long season blooming, but it starts a lot earlier than May for me by, a week to 10 days. And so this is a host plant for the black swallowtail butterfly, which is one of our, most beautiful butterflies, but it's also visited by a number of small bees and flies. So it has a tendency to be the smaller bees and flies. And so you have to get up close to them to really see this. So this is beautiful in arrangements, particularly, free-flowing wild flower arrangements, quite beautiful. I don't see this particular one as common, in sales. Usually the other Golden Alexander is what is the aria is what is usually available. So grab this one up. This does very well in full sun to light shade. I probably have all of mine with a little bit of shade in the afternoon. So they're in full sun most of the day, but afternoon hot sun protection on that. So this one is the heart-leafed Golden Alexander. So Landon, we've gone through 47 of how many plants did you have? You have a whole lot more plants than what we covered. It's pretty impressive what you've got in your plant sale. So I know
Yes.
you've put up the link. I'm showing you the link here, where to go and make the order.
Yeah, so we have 83 different plants. So when we initially talked about doing this webinar, we were like, okay, we're gonna have to choose 40. So we cut it down to 47. But there's so many good plants. I mean, there's not a plant really that this group doesn't like. So the sale is going on now through Earth Day. And then the pickup date is Saturday, May 8th at the Swansea Clinton Hills Conservation Park. It's the same address as Fletcher's in Swansea. But yeah, there's something for any landscape situation in the sale. And so we're really happy. There seems to be a lot of interest in native gardening these days. And if we all just added, a few native plants in our yards a year, it makes such a world of difference to some of these. Like as Ned and Elizabeth talked about, so many of these plants are hosts for, the butterflies and the bees, and they really depend on that kind of thing. And you just don't get that from planting a boxwood, But yeah, in addition to this, we have a lot going on at HeartLands this spring. We are going to be celebrating Tree Week in April, and we have, quite a few different activities going on for that. We also have a lot of volunteer opportunities coming up, and we just invite everybody to check us out online, Facebook, YouTube. I'm going to post this on YouTube tomorrow and send out a link. And yeah, let's see if anybody has any questions here as we're at the end. Doesn't look like it. Did you guys have anything to add, Elizabeth or Ned?
No,
Go ahead, Ned. You go
I
first.
just want to thank everybody for we started with 80 and we ended up with about 50. So I know we went on a long time, but there's so much information to try to get out there. And we're really excited that so many of you are interested. And thank you too for our out-of-state visitors. So it was really nice that you stayed with us as well. Thank you, Landon and Elizabeth. I learned a lot.
I always learn a lot anytime I'm talking with anybody about plants. And so I hope that our listeners will see a couple of native plants that maybe, as Landon says, incorporated into their landscape, because anytime you add something to the food web, it encourages, others into your yard. So if you increase your insect population and your larvae in your yard, that increases birds in the yard as well. So it's a nice win-win situation. Plus you get to have the beauty of the plants. So
It gets to be kind of an addiction, as you can tell.
Yeah, definitely. So Landon, thank you for inviting Ned and I. We enjoyed talking about something that we absolutely love as well. And so, and we've also enjoyed shopping to feed our addiction a little bit more.
Yeah.
Well, thank you guys so much. Yeah, if anybody has any questions, feel free to shoot me an email. My name is Landon, my name's Landon Brooks, but my email is landon.brooks@heartlandsconservancy.org. And I guess we will see you outdoors soon.
Bye, y'all.
Happy planting.